At the University of Notre Dame, Australia. I'd like to warmly welcome you to the university and to this lecture in honour of Father Peter Slattery. I also thank you at this time for turning off or silencing your mobile phones. This lecture is in honour of Father Peter Slattery. Father Peter was a Carmelite priest and a Doctor of Education, well known for his ministry in Western Australia and Victoria. In Victoria, he served as a lecturer in religious education at Yarra Theological Union. He was an examiner in religious education for the Melbourne College of Divinity. In Western Australia, he served as a consultant and a secondary school's religious education coordinator for the Catholic Education Office. He also served as a part-time lecturer for the Catholic Institute of Western Australia. Father Peter was a great supporter of the University of Notre Dame. From 1990, he served as the university's Deputy Director of Development and helped lay the foundation for the university that Notre Dame is today. As a Carmelite priest, Father Peter was a scholar of his tradition and spirituality. In 1990, he published the book, The Springs of Carmel, an exposition of Carmelite spirituality. In 1994, he published St. John of the Cross, a spirituality of substance. Father Peter died in 1995. After his death, his father, Jack Slattery, endowed this lecture as a personal way of honouring him. Tonight, we have the honour of hosting Dr Rod Pattenden and Dr Rachael Kohn, who have come to Perth as judges for the Mandorla Art Award and the Mandorla Youth Award. To introduce them and this evening's presentation, I'd like to hand over to Dr Angela McCarthy, Lecturer in Theology at the University of Notre Dame and Chairperson of the Mandorla Art Award. Dr McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogilvie. And good evening to you all. It's indeed very gratifying to see so many of you who are willing to come out on a winter's night. It was a very pleasurable day, but quite a cold night. I'd like to welcome Reverend Ron Larkin, who is one of the patrons of Mandorla, and his wife, Reverend Viv Larkin. Our other patrons are Archbishop Hurt and Archbishop Costello, supported by all three of their denominations. One of our other sponsors is the Benedictine community of New Norcia, and I understand Don Chris Power, thank you Don Chris, is here this evening from New Norcia. As this award is acquisitive, our collection of artworks since 1985 have been housed and exhibited at the New Norcia Gallery. We also thank Cardinal George Pell, who is a supporter of the Mandorla Art Award through the Archdiocese of Sydney, and also St Joseph's Parish Subiaco is one of our sponsors. The Mandorla Art Award was established in 1985 as an effort to continue the patronage of Christian art so that contemporary artists could be drawn into expressing biblical themes. The effort's been rewarded with many notable artworks that are now in our collection in New Norcia and currently on exhibition in New Norcia if any one of you would like a lovely drive in the country. Our award has always had that biblical connection, and the theme this year is from Galatians 4, verse 4. And in the fullness of time, God sent his only Son, born of a woman, born under the law. It's proved to be a challenging theme, and we will name the winner on Friday night in Perth Town Hall, and I encourage you all to view the award if you can, as it will be open in the Perth Town Hall until Sunday, August 19th. Our lecturers tonight, Dr Rachael Kohn and Dr Rod Pattenden, are both judges for our award, and that is why they arrived in Western Australia today, fresh off the plane. So the procedure for this evening is that both Rachael and Rod will address us on their particular aspect of religious art. Rachael will address us on religious art and the soul, and Rod on religious art and the body. Following that, we will be open for questions and a conversation about religious art, because it certainly is an area of academia and it's an area of contemporary discussion that is well worthwhile. So, our first speaker, Dr Rod Pattenden, is a minister of the Uniting Church in Australia and has just taken up a role as minister of the Adamstown Parish Community in Newcastle, and he has a particular brief to set up a visual performing arts program there. Rod is an artist, an art historian and educational facilitator interested in this particular connection between spirituality and the arts. He's written and lectured widely on these aspects of the arts and creativity in Australia and overseas. He was coordinator of the Institute of Theology of the Arts and is currently chairperson of the Blake Prize for Religious Art, as well as co-creative director of Interplay Australia, which is an organisation that offers a creative and affirming approach to being human, using gentle movement, voice, story and playfulness. He has particular strengths in the areas of visual arts, performance skills, movement and exploring the processes of creativity. His PhD was focused on contemporary art and spirituality. As an artist, he's been involved in a wide variety of community projects and management roles, artist in residence and creative facilitation of events. He's initiated a number of community arts projects that have enhanced the community building and healthy cultural diversity, which is so well needed in our Australian contemporary society. He's written widely on the arts, contributing to key publications on the work of a number of Australian leading artists, as well as developing a number of innovative exhibitions and installation projects, including liturgical art within sacred space. He's also been involved in the wider Asian community in a publication about arts and Christianity. So, we welcome you, Rod, to come and speak to us on religious art and the body.
Thanks, Angela, for that warm welcome. I'm very, very grateful to be here, and we were having dinner just before we arrived here this evening. Rachael and I, members of the committee, and Rachael and I expressed a great deal of anticipation and excitement to getting there on Friday and have a look at the 65 finalists for this year's prize. We can already anticipate we've got into those questions about why do artists do what they do? How do they ever come up with this conclusion to the task of interpreting or illustrating or dealing with the passage chosen for them? Artists are really annoying, inspirational, wonderful voices. It really affirms the role of the arts, but it leaves us with lots of questions. And as chair of the Blake Prize, it also, I think, brings controversy. So I think I'm going to get my hands dirty with the first half of the lecture about body, which is the most inspirational or controversial part, and then Rachel's wonderful voice will illuminate the soul connection, and I'll leave it to her to bring it all beautifully together. So that's our task tonight. My task is to talk a little bit about the connection with religious art and the body. The things that we can say about that in the Christian tradition is that this is where it becomes most controversial or most comforting. Christianity is distinctive in its affirmation of the life of the body. It's in the body we experience pain and ecstasy and the delight of being human. So it's an interesting area because the arts are also about enfleshment and incarnation. It's through the arts, whether it's dance or literature or music or the tickling of the ear, the movement of our bodies, and the seeing with our eyes, that we actually celebrate our own receptivity as incarnational beings. And that's an area I want to talk about when we get the images up and running. And several years ago, as chair of the Blake Prize, we had a very large controversy. This is a great disappointment to somebody who's a great advocate, if not an evangelist, a person who's involved as a curator and chair of the Blake Prize. It's kind of an evangelistic thing. As an artist, I eventually found myself at art school and then went into the ministry. It's a very unusual job trajectory. Most ministers or priests are usually teachers or accountants, much more solid folk. And it was certainly part of my hope that the arts would become more a part of the life of the church as we reimagine what our faith is in this particular moment in history. But we live in an environment where images are much more part of the everyday way we negotiate our lives in a postmodern situation. Young people use images all the time to negotiate their commitments. They shop for a life, as it were, for who they want to be. It's quite a different intellectual and philosophical environment. And images become much more important in that kind of environment. In 2008, I was awoken by journalists at 6 o'clock in the morning after the opening of the Blake Prize with this controversy on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Now, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney usually has sport on the front page, so it's very unusual that they take any interest in artwork. But the photographer from the Daily Telegraph had spied several works up on the wall that he thought would make a great front page story, and without little trouble this controversy began to unfold on this day. A very small statue that an artist had obviously got from a second-hand store and put on her face, Mary, a burqa, a Muslim face covering. Is this contravening codes of conduct? Well, according to the Daily Telegraph and the people they interviewed, including Prime Minister Howard, who was otherwise asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, I don't know how they got a comment that they did. So he was deeply offended on behalf of good church folk of Australia. And another image of Osama bin Laden and the face of Jesus Christ in the one picture. Now, these works are contemporary art. They're an attempt to address questions of art and the media. But what struck me was the way in which the media then began to unfold the story around tensions between Christians and Muslims in Sydney in particular. And by 11 o'clock in the morning, I had a journalist asking me on camera, "And what do you think about the death threats to the artists, Reverend Pattenden?" And I stopped the interview, it was Channel 9, so you don't usually do this, and we got the artist on the phone, and there were no death threats whatsoever. But there is an air that we breathe these days about interreligious difference or dialogue, or just plain hatred, which I think informs our discussion of what is religious art. We don't live in a culture where we live within our own particular tradition. We have to traffic and understand difference at every step. And here's a picture of the two works, which really just sat quietly in the corner and didn't draw attention to themselves, except that they became a front page story. Several phone calls later, I had members of the public ringing me, deeply offended and upset about what had happened. And I had to deal with those phone calls respectfully and try to understand what the nature of the offence was. These artists had clearly not intended to offend anyone, but were wanting to make some comment about issues of contemporary concern. One woman said to me, "When I saw that on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, it was as if my stomach had been punched. It's as if the artwork had somehow reached out to her and punched her in the stomach. So deeply offended was she." Now, as an art historian, you kind of note that sort of thing with some concern. Do images have the capacity to deeply embroil our guts? Do they, in fact, turn us inside out? There is, in fact, a lot of evidence to say that images somehow are part of the archaeology of our belief. They lie somewhere down deep in our bellies. They tell us who we are as bodies, as people in a tradition, and something about where we're headed. So if this anecdote is true, images are not just intellectual things, particularly religious ones. They lie deep within our skin. The work that did win the Blake Prize that year is this wonderful painting by Shirley Purdy, which is of 12 Stations of the Cross. And she came to the gallery and flew down from the north part of Western Australia. And in the gallery, there's a photograph of her, and she began to recount the story of how this community in Warman sing these songs as part of their liturgy. And I asked her what does her community know about suffering and about the story of Jesus that makes this particularly relevant to her community. And she began to have tears roll down her eyes as she told us about the story of the massacre at Mistake Creek, which happened in the 1930s, where a significant number of her forebears were murdered by mistake by the local station owner. It's a very well-known story in the northwest Kimberley area. But for this woman in her 60s, it was a story that is still present, where she's connecting the story of Jesus Christ and the suffering one with the contemporary experience of her own history. And it reminded me as she cried that religious images are deeply buried in our bodies. They're part of fundamentally who we are, and sometimes it's through art they are in fact examined and come to the fore. This is a lithograph she's done of the tree where the bodies were buried of the 20, 30 folk, her grandparents' age. It's a great boab tree, and it's somehow been transformed by two fingers as she's counting out the numbers of her parents, grandparents' age who passed away. It's kind of very kind of creepy. You sort of get that feeling up the back of your spine of a memorial image about death and suffering. So images are everywhere. We swim in a sea of images, and they train who we are as bodies, how we think, how we understand discipline, about how we run the race of life and where we're headed. One artist that you would probably know is Dr Kohn. He has won the prize here, and he's hopefully going to see his work tomorrow as I go up to New Norcia. He's an artist I hope that you'll be familiar with. He, I think, is one of our great priestly artists. He's one who takes our experience as a body into an experience of like an icon. He reminds us that life is ordered, that it has a sense to it, a sensuality and an intelligence. He's very much fulfills, I think, the role of the priest. Everything is okay. I think that's what priests are supposed to do, aren't they? Every time they conduct a liturgy, everything's fine. Everything's okay. There is an order to life underlying all this chaos. And in his work, I think he exhibits a wonderful connection to the Australian landscape. He grew up in the north part of Queensland, and he has a very rich, evocative use of the language of birds and trees, and the air being filled with a golden glow of a presence which is near. And it's wonderful that he anticipates, I think, a very contemporary concern we now face with the climate change issues, about how we care about the environment. Here's an artist who drew on inspiration of Aboriginal art as well. And here he has the Eucharistic symbols and bird references and the natural world around us. He's very calming and a very calm person. He only passed away a couple of years ago, a great Australian artist, and here you can see his influence with Aboriginal art. Now, John had a wonderful opportunity when he was a young artist to do a commission. It's such a poverty in our religious traditions that few artists are actually asked to do works in churches or synagogues or other religious places. And here, John, he knew the local priest down here in DY in Sydney. This is St Kevin's. I hadn't realised that St Kevin, I guess he must be an Australian saint, having the name Kevin. DY in 1960, 1959, this building was put up, a ferro-concrete building with 7 peaked roofs, actually like a tent structure, very innovative piece of work. And John and his wife Barbara got down on their hands and knees and crushed tiles from a kitchen display, and the congregation walked in over these marks on the floor every Sunday. And they're still there to this day. He also designed these grill steel work here on the chapel on the side. It's DY, it's the beach. So it's a wonderful evocation of the place. These Stations of the Cross. This is the Good News Bible that just been published, so there was that kind of tradition of simple graphics. But what is a worry is a mainly Italian parish now, and they have different tastes. And so certain statues have crept back in, and plastic flowers are everywhere. So some things change and some things stay the same. Inspired by that example, I had the opportunity to work in the church I was minister of at Paddington. I got a major grant from the Australia Council to commission 6 artists to create work within the environment of the church. Because I was the minister, and it was my last year in the church, I got away with this. And I was able to take out all the furniture and turn the church for 6 months into a continual exhibition space in which we worshipped week by week. Miley T is a Vietnamese artist. She's a refugee. She's been working with shoes. She said when she arrived in Australia, she looked at her feet most of the time. She was too shy or ashamed to engage people with her eyes. And with this curiosity of looking at shoes, she began to talk to people, borrow their shoes or have shoes given to her as gifts. And in the middle of the church, as you walked in, you could smell old shoe leather. What a wonderful incense. I hope God was well pleased. This is 10 years ago, and it was about then we were beginning to discuss this thing about boat people and how we deal with people beyond our borders. Around the edge, her partner Tim Johnson also had work which referred to Buddhist ideas and Hindu ideas. And here you have 2 paper sculptures of bones, 2 artists about to paint themselves into life. So here you have an attempt to create artwork in an environment where people begin to question. Where are the places people go to in public life to bring their questions about their life, their ethics, moral dilemmas, to live their life in a body? And so in this period, as an art gallery or as a sacred space, or both, this was a wonderful opportunity to play with these ideas. John Adair, very influenced by Jewish mysticism, created a large box inside the church, 5 cubits high, 5 cubits wide, and 15 cubits long. Now you all know those measurements. This is the tabernacle, the tent, that the ancient Jews trudged around with and installed every time they had a stop for a few weeks. His idea was that it appeared in its correct orientation east during the period of the Feast of Tabernacles, where Orthodox Jews would be out on the verandas in temporary coverings. A great big box in the church, what was that about? And then you went inside, and he turned his paintbrush around. With the end of it, he poked holes in the black plastic, creating this mysterious star-like interior. My goodness. I heard more confessions in there than I heard anywhere else. People were just enthralled with the intimate wonder of this space inside the church. And this work of crushed marble by Nicole Ellis, which reflected the light. This is September 11th. This is the week that the attacks occurred in the United States, where buildings were reduced to rubble. On the morning that this happened, a woman came into the church who was on holidays in Sydney from Boston, and she wrote in the book that here in this rubble she saw the hope of renewal. This artist is influenced by Japanese Zen spirituality, the great gardens in Japan. What's it doing inside a church? It's making connections. And this work of felt, elaborate on the floor, hanging images. All this work of sheer curtains and acidic colour, melting forms on the pulpit instead of a preacher. The church as a curtain, torn apart the space of the body. And this work of an 1877 lighthouse flashing inside a building that was built in 1877. So this project offered some opportunity to create sacred space and to use art in its own integrity as a way of illuminating that connection about what it is to be a body and where you come from and where you're going. And in conclusion, I want to offer another artist and another perspective, George Giddos, who has a number of works, I believe, at Norcia. He's Australia's most well-known war artist. If John Coburn is the priest, then George Giddos is the prophet, and he knows nothing sacred that he will not question. Here is his winning work, Blake Prize in 1995, The Preacher. In the middle of an eyewitness situation in Rwanda, watching thousands of people being murdered in front of him as part of an Australian peacekeeping effort, he had to watch and just not get involved as a UN peacekeeper. He came across this young man who was reading the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' words, "Blessed are you when you're a peacemaker," etc. He said in the midst of all this most terrible situation he'd ever found in his life, there was someone who was reminding people that they were human. What is it to be religious? It's to be human, to have compassion. And so in this body of work, there he is in Afghanistan. He's committed to go to places where people are disfigured, their life is torn apart, and to probe the questions of what it is to be human in those places. People had come to this place on the first anniversary of the Rwandan Civil War, believing that either the UN peacekeeping forces would protect them and they would be safe. Rwanda is a Christian country where 1/10 of the population was murdered by their neighbours in a period of a couple of hundred days. And why? Why does that happen? Why does that continue to happen in our present history? And how does God care for bodies? So I might just leave it there, perhaps with that image, placing that alongside John Coburn. Religious art reminds us of the utter beauty of being human, the delight that we feel from the bottom of our toes to the top of our head, the joy of being alive. But it also brings us into a territory of edges and questions and makes us perhaps shake up the stability of what we believe on. I like both gestures. I like art to challenge me. I like artists to stretch my capacity to think and feel, and also to comfort me and bring me back to the centre. I think that's healthy, to live a life both in the centre and at the edge.
Thank you very much, Rod. Judy, could you please now turn on the lights? Rachael is Canadian-born and graduated with an MA and PhD in Religious Studies from McMaster University and was awarded the prestigious Leverhulme postdoctoral fellowship when she took up at the University of Lancaster in England. Before joining the ABC in 1992, she taught religious studies at Sydney University and in universities in England and Canada. Rachael was, in 2005, awarded a Doctor of Letters from the University of New South Wales for her services to community, for fostering religious understanding through her broadcasts, public speaking, and her book, The New Believers, Reimagining God, by HarperCollins. She's recently published Curious Obsessions in the History of Science and Spirituality with ABC Books in 2007. She's won 3 gold medals from the New York Festival's International Radio Competition and has produced documentaries for ABC TV's Compass on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Buddhism East and West, and Pause for Thought, that is spelled P-A-W-S. It's about the spirituality of animals. She currently presents The Spirit of Things on ABC Radio, and if any of you have been listening, there have been some very beautiful stories, particularly one that was very moving that I listened to last week. And it's a project that she's running on the monthly series called My Spiritual Diary, where she has notable Australians, such as the beautiful flautist Jane Butter and Moira Rayner, who is a campaigner for justice. They keep a diary over a month and then share it with Rachael and the listeners. And the listeners have responded very warmly to this series and to the way they make deep spiritual connections that are woven through their lives, both those on the radio and the response of the listeners' own lives and spirituality. Rachael has an abiding interest in the way in which the arts themselves are an expression of our spirituality, as we've just heard through Rod, as the expression through the body. And Rachael, we're also pleased to hear from you on Twitter that you feel privileged to be here for the Slattery Lecture and to be a judge. And as we know, this extraordinary way that our world works in contemporary social media has taken a different turn for us all. So we welcome you to Western Australia and to be part of both of these events. So we welcome Dr Rachael Kohn.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I have to say, I had an unexpected epiphany this evening. George Kitto's painting has always stayed with me from the time I first saw it many years ago. And tonight I understood why it had such a deep resonance. Some of you may know the most famous image from the Holocaust. And it's a boy. It's a boy with his hands up like that, with fear in his eyes. That was just emblazoned there, so many decades later, in another situation of complete horror. And I just saw those two images together in a way I never imagined until this evening. Well, as you heard, no images. They have to be up here, I'm afraid. And I've approached this the way I do each week. I write scripts and I write things. So I have written something for this evening. So I'm glad you were able to have the experience of extemporaneous commentary by Rod with pictures. Now, a bit of an essay on this topic of the soul of art. And I started with Nicolas Poussin's painting called The Golden Calf, which depicts the Israelites in a debauched state of dance around a prominent image, a calf, golden and elevated, but inert and utterly devoid of moral force. The revelers have forgotten the great mission of Moses, and in impatience satisfied their personal lust for the physical pleasures of worship for its own sake. Answerable nonetheless to a higher law that points to the reality beyond their sensory desires, the writhing humanity in Poussin's painting is depicted in an eerie light that portends doom. A desperate rite overtakes them, and the true meaning of God's relationship to the world is forgotten. Momentarily, they have lost their soul, but not the possibility of redemption. For this is but a stage in the unfolding story of the Bible, which, like Poussin's painting, points the way to God's saving grace, just as it reveals humanity's faltering efforts to keep the faith. The pride of Aaron and the voluptuous allure of his priestly cult are contrasted to the pathos of a rejected Moses, whose only gift to the Israelites was a covenant with an unseen God, and the promise of a distant land. In our day, the transcendent God has taken a beating, just as it did back in Moses' time, and repeatedly since then. Indeed, the Christian Church chose to believe in a God made flesh, while retaining belief in the Holy Spirit and God the Father. When the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, under the law. The Israelites, on the other hand, preferred to keep it simple. One transcendent God who gave instructions to all Israel on how to fulfill his requirements in daily life. Well, when I say the Israelites kept it simple, let me rephrase that. There is nothing simple in the world of gods and men. Over time, religious traditions express humanity's intense desire to create anew its relationship to the divine, to reimagine it in ways that satisfy one's whole being: physical, intellectual, emotional, social, as well as aesthetic dimensions. Both Jews and Christians have been doing that for millennia. To reimagine is to think on something that is partly hidden. The transcendent God is that, but it's a hiddenness that is not thought of as entirely removed from our pitiable lives on earth. Not since Jacob struggled with the angel, or Job sensed God in the whirlwind, has the divine been removed from our experience in the here and now of our lives. Having said that, remembering God's transcendent nature prevents the solipsistic error of the calf worshippers throughout history who've mistaken their own lives or their treasured objects for ultimate reality. To point to the sine qua non beyond yourself is to know a transcendent God, even when this awareness is stirred by your own experience of life and its material limitations. So, what has this to do with the soul of art? I think that art can have soul in the way that a prayer is a bridge between the I and the thou. Of course, art itself doesn't have a soul in the traditional sense, but it can appeal to our soul, which yearns for the presence of the divine. By imagining or hinting at the divine presence, art can quicken faith or profoundly challenge it. Either way, it draws in the viewer to encounter the face of God, or to deeply question its absence. I use that terminology deliberately, for in the Western tradition it was Moses who begged God to show his face, and the answer came, no one sees the face of God and lives. Moses saw only God's back. Christianity changed that, but even Jesus was cryptic, half hidden, sowing confusion among his disciples by answering their question with a question. Who do men say that I am? What do I mean by encountering the face of God? In Psalm 13, the lament is heard, how long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? Jews and Christians who sing these phrases understand that sometimes we feel so lost, forlorn, or forgotten. Even the ability to imagine God escapes us. Losing hope is mistaking this finite existence for ultimate meaning of life. Joan of Arc said that imagination is the way God reveals himself to us, so that when the fourth psalm implores God to lift up the light of your countenance upon us, we know this to be an imagined benevolence, care, and love that the Israelites then and always hope to experience in their relationship to God. It is what all believers hope to experience in their relationship to God. If our soul is God's imprint on us, then the soul of art is God reflected in its mirror. The artist who produces religious art reveals in the painted or sculpted scenes from life a hidden, abiding presence of divinity which wills us to be more than anonymous players in a meaningless universe. The tragedy in Poussin's painting was his depiction of humanity as less than itself. The phrase taken from Paul's letter to the Galatians, which informs this year's Mandorla Art Prize, is a foundational Christian belief that Jesus was sent of God and born of a woman. It gave rise to the most pervasive image in Christian art, Mother Mary with her babe Jesus. By drawing on the universal mother and child union, a parade of the greatest paintings in Christian art communicates something about humanity that is more than itself. When is humanity more than itself? And when is it less than itself? Humanity is less than itself when it's reduced to mere physical existence, limited by the senses and self-centered drives, and opened Pandora's box. When is humanity more than itself? When its physicality is interpreted through a divine narrative and harnessed to a morality that is lived not for oneself, but for others. I know that to speak about a morally bound narrative is countercultural today. Social theorists say we live in a post-narrative culture, or is it a multi-narrative, possibly even an anti-narrative culture? All are touted as models of the modern West. But what will hold up a mirror to this life without an agreed narrative, if not something as visually powerful as art? At present, a great deal of art celebrates the absence of narrative, leaving only its materiality. I recently held a public discussion about the work of the Belgian Catholic artist Belinda de Bruckner, who recreates with forensic precision dismembered, decapitated, and amputated humans and animals. That they are headless is significant, not only because they are thus rendered impersonal, but they lack God's face. If we are made in God's image, then surely it is our face, the map of our feelings, which carries God's imprint. Belinda's creations shock and horrify. She says she wants to both frighten and comfort simultaneously. To what end? No narrative is provided. She doesn't believe in offering one. She says she does not have a narrative. But she does believe that horror can turn into affection. Isn't that the Stockholm Syndrome? Where the captive falls in love with his captor? Or is it the battered wife syndrome, where violence is mistaken for love? I asked a young attendant what it was like to stand around, looking at the huge horse carcasses, strung up, legs splayed, undignified, headless. His eyes darted around the room, wasn't sure what he should say. Then he said, "It was shocking at first. But then I got desensitized, and I saw the beauty in it." Desensitized. Is that what we're aiming for? Shall we next be invited to appreciate the beauty of masses of entangled bodies scraped out of an Auschwitz crematorium? What desensitized life form are we normalizing? It seems to me a deeply inhuman inversion, a world gone mad, demonic. Isn't that the vision of William Butler Yeats in his poem, The Second Coming? I'm sure you all know this. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. When I note the smooth words wrapped around such brutalizing art by curators who don't question the flawed motives of their artists, but on the contrary, willingly promote their vision, I wonder if the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Shall we drown kittens and call it art, and wink at its suggestion of lost innocence? What if the reverse message is received? Does anyone care? Least of all the artist with no narrative to share? Something has happened to art. When Yoko Ono told the British art critic Waldemar Januszczak that a viewer is irrelevant to the value of her work, she explained that her art sends radiating energy out to the universe, and when there's enough of it, world peace will dawn. You might laugh, or hope she's right. But either way, when the viewer's reactions to art are dismissed as irrelevant, then art loses its soul because it refuses to speak to our souls. We live increasingly in a world that is beset by crisis, and our own lives seem to be hedged in more and more by urgent tasks, pressing needs, necessary ambitions. This is the proverbial rat race, the existential anxiety that makes every life stretch across an abyss for a limited period of time until it snaps and disappears into oblivion. This is life lived without a saving narrative, and therefore without hope. Can art do anything to counter this all too familiar human condition, full of purpose but no meaning? Yes, but not the jumble of billboards and faceless office towers that bear down on our urban spaces, darken our skies, and reduce us to soulless beings. A brutal built environment designed by commercial artists and architects for hire does not improve our outlook, but worsens it, because it is blind to our souls. It provides no space for relief, for repose, for reflection. I recently found myself in the Australian art collection of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, gazing at paintings by Vaughan Gillard, Pegone, Conder, Streeton, and Roberts. And I thought, what a marvelous gift they left us. In their scenes of pristine wild Australia and charming farmland, we entered a world that is not a photograph of a time long past, but an imagined Arcadia of serene beauty. Yet, it is the narrative they hint at which provides a message for our soul. I am aware that the spiritual narrative changes with time, that a Mondrian canvas in the painter's neoplastic style of cool order and balance was a harbinger of a new age that transcended the chaotic caprice of the organic world, the natural world. Mondrian believed that art could symbolize the moment when humanity is brought into consonance with the universe and society is composed of balanced relationships. Well, I think we are less taken today by abstract art's high hopes of a socially engineered world. Quite the reverse. Today, the tranquil scene of a landscape reminds us of the origin of things, of Eden, which the Western tradition placed at the very beginning of our story. And what was that story about? Of idyllic existence? Yes. But also one rent by human curiosity, desire, and will, leading to banishment, suffering, and loss, as well as a longing to return. So long as our art contains that story, it speaks to our souls of love, loss, redemption, of hope, and of becoming whole. It's not accidental that the garden remains an ideal, not only of earthly paradise, but also of a yearned for tranquility, where the landscape is not a mere object, but profoundly a subject. And that is the case not only in Western art, but throughout the art of the world, certainly religious art in Asia. The now humble landscape painting, banished to the outer regions of amateur art clubs and small galleries, is, I would argue, one of the most ensouled forms of art, and one that continually speaks to us of our profound human spiritual need for a meditative quiet place to ponder our brief time here on earth before we are interred in its folds. And yes, time, that familiar stranger that fools us into thinking that we are in command of it forever, is equally a gift of art. A photograph freezes time, but a painting can warm up eternity and allow us to enter it, however briefly, over and over again. Ensouled art speaks to us, to our yearning for eternity in a moment. No matter how many times you gaze on it, art can, like a mirror, fill us with hope. Our souls are tossed by the turmoil of our world and by the tragedies in our lives. There is nothing new to this litany of sorrows, except that they are available to us now in an avalanche of imagery manufactured for our morbid titillation and entertainment, delivered on iPad, iPhone, and TV. The challenge to art is to lift us above this barrage of brutality and allow us to see God's face. That, for me, is the soul of art. Thank you.
Very much, Rachel. What an extraordinary contrast that we've had, that wonderful sense of body and the image and how we work through those images, and then that beautiful essay on art itself. So we're open now to questions. So we can have a question that is a comment. This is also being filmed, so we will need you to use this diabolical piece of equipment. Professor Matthew. So do we have some questions or some comments that have emanated from that and that you would like either Rod or Rachel to comment on or to answer for you? Struck down. heaving a sigh of relief here. Father Chris.
I'd be interested in some comments on abstract art, in both regard to bodies, so the Jackson Pollock and the spattered canvas, and really abstract art. Is it saying something that fits in with Rachael's comment on the soul?
Rachel was talking about Piet Mondrian, sort of that, yes, the wonderful distillation of ideas.
Yeah.
Would either of you like to comment on that? Jump Rod? No, this one, you can come. That's the road.
Well, I'm just conscious that abstract art has a cultural context. At the turn of the century 1900s, there was a rise of interest in abstract art because there was also a rise of interest in the cultural horizon of the future. Lots of interesting religious ideas in Europe. And Kandinsky is famous for opening that up, that if you look deeper, you don't see representation, you see abstraction, the pure mediation of the future that was coming and sort of filled with hope. So it's an impulse towards freedom. Abstraction is wanting to tear apart the way you normally see things in a deeper way. So it's a conundrum, because abstraction, of course, isn't clear. So it's that sort of disclarity. The other period of the rise of abstraction in the 1960s with Jackson Pollock, and in that cultural context, that was the period of McCarthyism in the United States. It was the most socially repressive period in US history. But what were artists doing? They were trying to break that apart and express some fundamental gesture about the nature of the human spirit. To draw a line is an act of freedom. To make a mark is an expression of one's uniqueness and independence. So there are those impulses, and abstractionism tends to come in and out of popularity. And I just wonder, well, if you put it into that cultural context, it's also a fundamental religious expression of individuality, which is to be unique. It's not the same as everybody else. So sometimes in cultural periods, it's a calling out for the celebration of our difference.
One of the issues, of course, and particularly since that was the third faux pas, and particularly since tonight we're talking religious art, how does our community then, and I'm talking particularly our religious community, us, how do we then respond also to artists? It's a rare event in a new church in the 21st century where artists will be commissioned to express the transcendent. Our parish at Bateman is a notable exception. We have 3 extraordinary works there by Robert Juniper, a living treasure in this state. But how do we, as church, as community, how do we reach out and ask for artists who we have heard about tonight to express what we would really like to be drawn towards in terms of the sacred, in terms of that transcendent understanding? That was a comment. Now we've got another question. Rachel's got a comment.
I could actually just add a little bit to this. I think abstract art, in particular Mondrian and Rothko, and particularly Rothko, were very interested. Look, I'm not an art historian, so what I know is very patchy. So I shall always defer to Rod. But that sense of trying to get at the essence and purity of existence, and that's why the organic was considered quite profane. And there's an incredible reach for the transcendent in that early abstract art. But I'd just like to make also a little bit of a connection to the Kabbalah being the mystical Jewish tradition, has the different aspects of it. The philosophical Kabbalah has very strong theories about, well, because it's a major book, the Zohar begins with colors, and each color has a very strong philosophical, theological dimension. And so one of the great contemporary artists, Janet Lawrence, working in Sydney, produced these quite extraordinary colored glass panes in a new synagogue in Sydney, now 10 years ago, probably now, based on the Kabbalistic notions. And it saddens me very often that many people would walk in and think, oh, nice colors, okay, it's pretty good, kind of different. But how sad when they don't know the narrative, when they don't know its manifest, extraordinary, transcendent theological meaning, the depth of meaning of these colors. And I guess that's what I'm sad about when I see the drifting away of these deeper meanings that can so enrich one's experience of art. You always know when you learn something extra about a painting or some sculpture that it just suddenly, sends shivers down you because it has such a depth of meaning, and how easily we can all just walk by something, what's that, and don't bother to find out. So even abstract art has its deep and profound narratives.
So do we have another question from the floor? Comment? Yes? Rod.
Thank you. My question is I guess, is all art religious in a sense? That an artist, I'm sure, paints with their soul and heart. And you were saying that the soul is the image of God imprinted within. I think you said that. My quandary is, and it picks up a little bit on what you're saying, in a society that has essentially killed God.
Essentially what?
In a society that has essentially killed God. God is dead. I remember hearing someone talk on art saying to me that, religious art was, the tradition of art comes out of religion in a sense, especially Christian art, through the centuries. And when we, in the 19th century, the philosophers and so forth started killing off God, art had to turn in on another subject, and that subject is, who am I? And when I came tonight and I saw art, body and soul, I was thinking to myself of the art of body, which has led to self-mutilation and even the death of some artists. And it's led to immense, I think, anxiety, the expression of anxiety. Rothko killed himself eventually. What is this? What are artists who do not have a faith in God painting for us today? What are they trying? What is the soul they're painting?
I think I'd probably take a less romantic view than Rachael about the role of the artist. Maybe I hang around art studios too much. The thing I would like to say in response to that is probably to ignore your question and go somewhere else. It's a privilege of standing out the front. What I value about artists is that they help me see. So it's a really technical, ethical, moral issue that I find myself blind to the world I'm living in. It might be blind to wonder, or it might be just blind to injustice. And until I have that moment of seeing, oh my goodness, I have ignored, or have not in fact seen the evidence in front of me. And because artists are visual people, I really value the capacity to help me see again the world in which I live, and my responsibilities as an ethical, moral, or spiritual person. And particularly because I see a lot of contemporary art, while it may not spiritually uplift me, my prime piece of information, they're really helping me think harder and deeper about what it is to be a person of responsibility in the world in which I live. That may inspire me. That may make me feel sad. That may shock me. But at least those things then move me into a position where I exercise my freedom to act and to think and believe. So I don't get too fussed about whether an artist offends me or not. I just want to know what I do with that information. That's my responsibility. So I don't like to elevate artists to be too romantic, too offensive. I just think it's my role as a person in the culture I live today to think and to look really clearly about the things that I'm being sold by the media, by religious leaders or political leaders. I need to exercise my freedom as a person. And I really value when an artist breaks through the plastic stuff I get in the media all the time and helps me think more clearly. So it's probably that breaking open and honesty is for me a higher value than probably so.
She's not listening.
No. I have this big problem. It probably comes from being Jewish. And that is that you question stuff all the time. Not that other people don't, but it's one of my obsessions. And I've been in the field of religion and religious studies all my life. But one thing that I have never felt the need to do is to say that all religion's great.
Amen.
Therefore, I can also say not all art is great. I can also say that there are some religious leaders who are true to their calling and true to their faith and true to even the smallest aspect of their tradition. And there are those that are not, that are fraudulent, that are false, that are misleading to themselves and to others. We say that about politicians, we say that about writers, we say that about media people, journalists. We should also be able to say that about artists. I don't believe that artists, by simply doing their work, are in some way religious. Because if that were the case, then everything and everyone doing anything is religious. And that may be the case if you decide to define religion as that, as human experience. And I know that there are ways you can do that, and some people would argue that. But I'm for something else. I'm for being able to distinguish, to judge. I actually do believe that you can judge. After all, I'm here as a Mandorla judge. And in my favorite field of music, my heart breaks very often when I have to hear competitions and hear that someone's work is being judged. It does break my heart because I know that those musicians have worked so hard and they're being compared to one another like those Olympian swimmers who are 1,000th of a second apart. You know, how ridiculous is that? It is crazy. We do live in a world that requires us to judge in some ways, but not in others. Why not? Why not? We have to be strong enough to judge and to say when something's good, when something's bad, when the message is uplifting, when it is killing. I know historically there are things that are horribly unacceptable, including the Rwandan massacres. Nothing will ever, ever make me gaze on that and say there was something good in it. The only thing that's good in it is that some people emerged and lived and were able to live meaningful lives. And even then I doubt that there were many who could have survived that. So, Rod, I know you've just died to say something.
Oh, amen, sister, that was good. So the thing I guess I wanted to add to that is that I observe artists that work in their studio. And I think that's a real interesting model for the way the art works, because you have an artist, they've got an idea in there, they've got the obsession, they've got this idea, and they're rolling it out, and they get this, and then that doesn't work, and they rub it out. And they go a different way, and we only ever get to see the final things. Oh, that's a beautiful painting. How did they do that? You know, because it just looks like it has its own completeness. But the actual artistic program is very much like what you articulate. You're making judgments. You actually erase things. You cover them over. You make terrible sacrifices to wipe out a beautiful section of a painting that you've fallen in love with. Now, for religious people, if any of you happen to be, you should be very wary of the things that you fall in love with. Because we do fall in love with our images, and they become idols. We live in a culture which we often accuse of being idolatrous, but religious folk are particularly prone to this sin of idolatry. We fall in love with pious images, kitschy ideas, things which are less in their ability to serve us as human beings than we would wish. And what I also find refreshing about the role of artists is they confront us with our small and meagre ability to have an imagination sometimes. We are shocked or offended, but they also, I think to have a faith requires you from time to time to kill your God. I don't want to be misunderstood by that, but sometimes the images that we have of God really, they don't serve us well and should be questioned and challenged and thought through. And it's a great gift when someone can give us a paintbrush and we can rub it out and try again.
Further questions? Yes, over here.
While that's going, okay, there's another one down here, that'll be next. While it's going that way, it will be I'm sure it will be exciting and interesting to all of you for this current Mandorla exhibition and how that theme of Galatians, where there's a very strong Christology theology there, but there's also this really powerful, earthy, born of a woman idea, and how the two of those come together in the exhibition.
A difficult, uncomfortable area, but I'd just like to bring attention, Rachael especially, the old, very old painting of the Black Madonna.
Sorry? Black Madonna.
Black Madonna, where she looks upon the child and you see a rather sad face. And I was wondering what the artist is predicting, and what I see in itself is here she is looking upon this child. I think it should be an absolute joyous time for the mother. And the artist must be predicting he knows exactly where that child is headed. And it predicts to me the huge generosity of that woman. I'd like to see what your comment.
Yes, well, in that case, a painting such as that would be of great comfort to many a mother who gave birth to a child who she knew was going to die soon or was going to have an extremely difficult life. I'm sure that many, many women throughout the centuries gazed on those paintings, because there are many paintings of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who looks less than joyous. And she isn't always so placid. She is often somber. And I think that so many people throughout the centuries would have looked on that and found strength in losing their own firstborn or any child who died in their arms or soon after. That's all I can really say to that.
Thank you, Rachael. Just down the other side.
Comments been to you twice. There's a lot of religious art on the streets. I'm just wondering what you think about religious art being like the streets out in society, and should we have somewhere in Australia?
Should we have some of an on show, like in Europe, where there's a culture of art that is very religious and very epic?
Yeah, well, personally, I would love to see that. I am very sorry to see a world that is completely, that has censored out religion, that has forced it into a private zone. I'm very sorry about that. I think that is one of the reasons why many affluent Westerners make a beeline to countries such as Italy, France, well, France not so much, Eastern Europe, India, and parts of Asia. It's so interesting to see how Westerners, Aussies, who couldn't care less about religion in terms of their own tradition, and would probably be hugely uncomfortable if they saw a crucifix out, looking out onto a main street, and yet when they go to Indonesia or Thailand, they're just, they love it. It's great. It's fabulous. It's so rich and so out there. And, I think, wow, this says so much about how we bifurcate the religious world and our own responses to it. I personally think it comes from a great deal of embarrassment of ignorance, an embarrassment of how to react. Oh, it's okay to go into churches in Italy and Rome. Oh yeah, it's okay there. Nobody will see you, and back here, and you won't really have to talk to anyone, meet any of your friends, but you can really enjoy all the churches and everything. But here, there's, can't really talk about that. It's not really not comfortable. Loads of people are incredibly ignorant about their own traditional background, the traditions that their families come from. And I find the embarrassment is best dealt with by them by simply not going there, just shutting off. And I would strongly recommend much more of it out there. Make people at home with it, familiar. Why are we running away from it? That's to me a big kind of cultural existential question, and I'm sure Rod would have perhaps another take on it.
Then they also bring home the images from Asian countries and put them around the swimming pools because that's cool, without any understanding of whose religious item it is, whether it's a Buddha or whether it's some other form of religious image.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether my response will be adequate, but because I'm also working as a minister in a church, I've worked on a number of projects where artworks are being commissioned in churches, and also I think churches are generally getting pretty desperate about trying to reimagine themselves, and they're finally getting, or maybe the arts might be helpful in fulfilling their tasks. So there are some great examples around Australia of wonderful projects where artists have been brought in, because what the church I think needs at this current moment is ways to reimagine and represent faith in vigorous images adequate for the time in which we live. There's no level of lack of confidence in the story that Christians inherit, but we do need contemporary ways to express it. So that's a wonderful impetus. I'm really grateful to be in Birth and to support the prize here, because you're doing exactly that, offering alternatives, getting people to think about a story which is familiar, but is being represented in the clothing of today, which is really what the Renaissance artists did. There are wonderful stories of all these great artists in the 1500s who did radical steps like have the apostles wear the clothes of Florentine people in the streets, and for the first time people were coming into just, look, they look just like us. Aren't they amazing colours? And this is a scene that happened last year. It It was, you wouldn't go to the cinema, you'd go into the churches to see what the artists had done. These were the spectacles of the day, and they were representing a tradition in fresh ways, which was very powerful and effective and have lasted many hundreds of years. So I would hope there are further examples of being able to reinvigorate the tradition. There's nothing wrong with the tradition, but we do have a task to represent it in the terms and the challenges of the culture in which we live.
You were talking about the reinvention of the image, especially in art. I was wondering if you could comment on art as a form of communication, understanding the image without explanation. Like, for example, you walk into an old church and have the depictions of the scenes of the Bible on the wall, and they don't, although they have explanation behind it, you're able to interpret what's going on quite well, whereas an abstract equivalent require much more explanation.
Try again.
So the question was more, can you just comment on the art?
If you just hold the microphone up so we can hear it clearly.
Can you comment on art as a form of communication?
Sure. I'm all for art with labels. I think use as many means as possible to make the work come alive. I get to take people into the art gallery in New South Wales and other places. I love working with groups. And we get 10 people in front of the work. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? People say, oh, that girl looks like my niece. Oh, I had a chair just like that once. It's really interesting that everyone sees something they attach it to, and you can literally see the painting falling apart as people grab their favourite bits. But that begins a conversation about where does the attachment begin and what don't you understand, and oh no, that's about this, but so I love the way art actually creates a community of viewers. It's a great communication because it's not about what I think. It's much more richer when you stand in front of an artwork with a group of people, because it becomes a community conversation. And we reflect on the life of our own bodies, about our thoughts, our attachments, what our fingers touch, what turns us on, what disappoints us, our life stories start getting woven in. And what does it mean becomes, oh, who are we? It's just wonderful that you move this group process of, oh, what's this painting about? Oh, untitled, number 7. Oh, damn, no clues. And after 10 minutes or so, the painting has actually activated us. It's got our stories out. We've had to call upon our ability and our history and understanding to actually try and work out what this other thing, and it becomes more like a relationship. Who are you? Oh, I'm such and such. Oh, how old are you? Or why are you doing this to me? You actually have try it when you go to the art gallery next. Think more like a conversation rather than what's this mean? Because if you can say what it means, you've done 5 seconds and you can move on to the next word. You're just cataloguing it. So I really like the complexity, the porousness, the messiness of the communication that happens around art making, because it gets under your skin and does all that interesting stuff that art does so well. That was amusing. I don't know whether it answered the question though.
Can I add something to that? I remember a long time ago, the very first person I knew, a friend of mine who got married, was very anxious to color code her entire apartment, including her dishes, everything in the shade of purple, which I can tell you in 1970 was pretty unusual. Purple was very, very out there. But she also commissioned somebody, a painter, to paint paintings in shades of purple. And I was always a painter, painting, drawing ever since I was a kid, and would have gone into that seriously, except that my parents thought 2 in the family were quite enough, and I was the 3rd, so I didn't. But nonetheless, even then I thought, isn't that weird? Art as just color and decoration, but in fact, that's where a lot of people are when it comes to art. Art is the colors, art is the decorative, art is the way things are positioned, that'll look good there. Yes, I've got a room, that'll be good there. And when you ask the question about art as communication, I think sometimes, you know, we have to work on that. We can't always assume that art is both produced or received to communicate something more than just decoration, kind of an interesting decorative splash. I think there are lazy artists and lazy recipients of art, and just as there are in every field, let's not, you know, sanctify artists beyond what we all are. We are just human beings doing things that we think we can do, or we're slightly inspired. A lot of us have a lot of tremendous self-doubt about whether we're doing anything well enough. And a lot of artists are in that category as well. And some really are right. They're not too good. But it doesn't matter. Supposedly the art market will, you know, figure it out for them, you know, because they end up not being able to sell anything. Anyway, I think art should communicate something a lot of the time. And the other part of the time, it's just decoration, and let's not, you know, be too precious about it. Maybe I'm being precious.
Last question here. I think we're really moving into time zone. Yeah, twilight zone. And these people have gone all the way today. So our last question.
I'm an artist. I'm Jewish. I'm an atheist. And I attended the Mandorla art 3 times. One time the thing was to do with the birth of Jesus, and I don't remember the phrase. But I drew Mary with open legs, and Jesus' head there, you know, in her legs. And this was exhibited in University, actually in a very good spot. And you know, my art is very strong, very controversial, a lot of nudity, a lot of meaning. Sometimes it was, some people say, called it religious. What is religious art, really? You know, can an atheist draw religious art? Yeah, it's just...
In my experience, atheists have very strong views about religion. They often, as we were discussing today, often have very strong views of God too. It may not be my view of God, but they nonetheless have them. I see no reason why an atheist could not paint a work that has religious meaning, because I think atheists are often thinking about religion quite a lot, if only to argue against it, if only to define it against themselves or themselves against it. To me, there are lots of religious people who couldn't really come up with good religious art, quite possibly. Rod, what would you say?
We live in a culture, a secular culture, and by definition, a secular culture will define religion as a specialist form of conduct. It has its own sphere, that's religion. So religious art will be about the cult of religion only. That's that view. But if you're religious, you usually see the whole of life as interesting, and you feel quite pegged and narrow. If you only, you know, I don't think most religious people are disinterested in religion. I hope not. So there's an argument going back in our culture that the secular impulse will say, well, you religious people and religious art should only be about religious images or holy people or identifiable decoration for churches. But religious folk will probably have a different trajectory, and they'll say, all of life is religious because it's about flourishing and being human and reaching your full potential, whatever words we might use. So this is one of the fundamental tensions in our culture, that we live in a wider cultural conversation where religious people are always being put back into a small sphere of influence. You shouldn't be talking about education or mining or gender issues. If you're religious, that's your sphere, the family or some other small area like that. So it's an interesting tension in our culture. So what's religious art?
Rachael, Rod, thank you for such a great presentation. I'm going to break a couple of rules here. So if I say the wrong thing, I'll rely on John, who's doing the videography, to erase this and I'll deny everything. Rod just clarified something for me about the importance of understanding religious art. And to do that, I'm going to disagree with Rod. When he said that we don't get the chance to see artists in process, putting up the easel, doing something, a draft, erasing it, and putting out the final masterpiece, generally that's true. But then I thought, what if we conceive of this world, this creation, as a work of art? And if we conceive of God as the supreme artist, of which we're all a part, and we haven't seen the final outcome yet, not yet, but we can see the unfolding work of the artist. For me, that actually says something about art, something about creation, and certainly something about the need to maybe not fully understand art, but to appreciate it. And to have persons like Rachael and Rod speak about this is something for which I'm very grateful. There are people to thank tonight, to all of you for coming here and making this a very special Slattery Lecture. I thank you. We have behind the scenes members of the School of Philosophy and Theology, the Office of University Relations, who have been working very hard on this evening. Dr. McCarthy, who's really the brains and the power behind getting the lecture here tonight. I'm very grateful to you. And to Dr. Rod, Dr. Rachael, we've got a small token of our appreciation, which we'd like to thank you with right now. So thank you. So on behalf of the University of Notre Dame, Australia, I'd like to thank you all very much for attending tonight, and warmly invite you to refreshments will be served just outside. So thank you very much.